Dear friends and Gouldians, today a very special guest is with us, connected from Toronto. Professor Page is an American writer, music critic, editor, producer, and professor who won in 1997 Pulitzer Prize for his music criticism for the Washington Post. Tim Page was a friend of Glenn Gould, who has worked with him on a various occasions and whom we have the honor of interviewing today. A big welcome applause to Professor Tim Page. Hello, Tim. How are you?
I am fine. I'm delighted to talk with you. We're a long way from each other, but I'm in Toronto, and I've had just gorgeous weather here so far.
Beautiful. The weather is beautiful today, even here. So I have many questions, as you know, to ask you. And I would like to start from the beginning. How did you met Glenn Gould, and how was your first meeting with him? What were your feelings and impressions?
Well, basically what happened was it was his 25th anniversary with CBS Masterworks. And they actually did kind of a big deal about it. They issued a set of unreleased recordings, and that kind of wonderful thing he did about his hysteric return. And in any event, Glenn said that he would be up for an interview with a couple of different magazines or papers. And to my amazement, he chose my little, we used to call them underground magazines. You know, they were sort of, artsy, and we had a very small circulation of about 40,000 readers a week. So it was not exactly one of the big papers at that point. But what happened was he agreed to do this, and that was great. So we set up a chance to talk on the phone, and it started around 10 o'clock and went on till after midnight, certainly. And I was anxious at the start, but he was playful and he was funny. And he told me to call him Glenn right away, which was, startling for a 26-year-old. And he was very much, I think now we have a greater understanding of Glenn, and I wouldn't have been so anxious about it because now it's known that he was playful and he was funny. But back then he was sort of seen as this reclusive hermit of the North. And I thought he'd be very distant. And of course, it was quite the opposite. We were basically friends by the end of the call. So that was it. The article came out with a terrible headline, but he was smart enough about the media to know that reporters don't choose their headlines. And so he forgave me immediately, knowing that I had nothing to do with it. And we were friends from then on. And he would call every, week or so for a long while. We actually talked quite a lot. And then I only finally met him in person at the very end of his life.
And he also called you during the night sometimes? He woke up?
He didn't wake me. He tried to be very polite about anything he did. And he always called person to person, which is a forgotten device now, but it was a way of calling up a house, and if you said that the person who he wanted was not there, no charges would go through. The problem with person to person was if you did say, yes, I am he, it would become a very expensive phone call. So I always told Glenn, why don't you just call me back? I'm here, don't pay $3 or $4 a minute. And he says, no, it's part of the arrangement with the telephone company. And I was okay. So he regularly spent over $1,000 a month on making phone calls. But we would talk sometimes 2-3 hours. And it was always a real pleasure. He was, tremendous fun, and he always remembered our conversations from before. And so, yeah, that's how it all started.
And you confirmed the sense of humor of Glenn. As Lorne Talk said to us, he had a great sense of humor. John Fraser told us he had a great sense of humor. Everyone told this beautiful thing because it was gorgeous and full of life. And you then traveled to Toronto to record this famous, amazing record about the Goldberg variation, where you talk with Glenn about the two versions of this recording, and which you analyzed during that program. How did the idea for this special record came about?
Oh, that was all Glenn. I attended a showing of the Mont Saint Jean film. And so I'd finally gotten an idea of what Glenn would look like and what he would, be like in person. But then when the record was just about to come out, he said, I really want your thoughts on this record. And I was, I was flattered by that. And I listened to the record and I wrote down some of my thoughts. Glenn sent me a copy of the new version of the Goldberg Variations and asked me what I thought. So I listened to it a few times, and I wrote down notes. Yeah. And the next time Glenn called, I talked with him. He said, "So what did you think?" And so I gave him my thoughts, and all of a sudden I realized he was writing. You can sometimes tell when you're talking on the phone with somebody and then they're suddenly taking down what you're saying. And so anyway, so we talked for a bit and he said, "Oh, well, thank you. That's interesting to know." And so the next time he called me, he had written a play which he wanted Tim Page to play Tim Page, saying things that Tim Page actually believed, but he wanted to write this whole script around it. And I thought, well, sure, because at that point, I was mostly a radio person rather than an established music critic. I had a daily show in New York City. So I didn't feel that I was compromising myself by agreeing to play in a scripted role, which is something I wouldn't do now. But back then, I'm 26 years old, or at that point I was 27 years old. And I thought, well, yeah. So he said, and we'll pay you to come up to Toronto, and I'll put you up in the hotel, and we'll talk, and we'll have the and we'll make the recording. And so that's what I did. And in late August of 1982, I flew to Toronto, and Glenn put me up in the same hotel, the Inn on the Park, where he liked to work. The hotel's been torn down in recent years. It was then very luxurious. And, I had a terrific time. I went there. I was a little nervous about meeting him in person. He said he would come to my room to get me because I would get lost if I looked for his studio, and he was absolutely right. It was a big labyrinthine hotel where you had to go down all sorts of different pathways, and then you'd find where he was. But so he showed up, he knocked on the door, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be amazing. So I opened the door. He put out his hand, which I took as tenderly as I could and shook it gently. I was quite surprised that he offered to shake hands. And then his eyes did not meet mine for a while. He sort of looked down and was, clearly he was as anxious as I was in a funny way. But then after an hour or so talking in his studio, we started to look at each other and started to feel comfortable with that. You mentioned that he was gorgeous, and I have to say he was not gorgeous by that point. He was, it was very clear he was in bad health. I was shocked by the difference between the film, which he'd done with Bruno the year before, and the person who came to greet me. It looked like large hunks of his hair had been torn out, and he was very paunchy and very, very pale. And I was concerned about his health, but he was marvelous company. And, we would laugh about things. We would talk about films and philosophy. And he showed me this movie he'd done the soundtrack for, The Wars, and he'd order food for me late at night. And, we talked till about 1 or so the first night. And then I was grateful to go back and get some sleep because I was then and still am an early riser. But the second night was the night that we tried to record the interview in his studio, but there was something that was going wrong. And forgive me, I don't remember entirely what it was. We were getting some kind of strange sound, or one of the microphones didn't work. And so he had the idea of calling his friend Kevin Doyle, who was his engineer.
We had a beautiful interview with Kevin Doyle.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Yes.
He's such a nice man. I like Kevin so much.
Yes.
And so Kevin met us in downtown Toronto at a studio which mostly did rock recordings. But anyway, we did the interview then. We probably started at around 2 a.m, and I was very tired. I'm not a good actor to begin with, but I was extraordinarily tired. And we did the interview till maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. And it was interesting because my strongest memory of that is that Glenn was all business when it was work. There were none of the little comic asides that he would do when you were talking with him. It was all, let's get this done, and let's not be distracted in any way, and we'll get this done, and then we'll talk, And so we worked for maybe 3 hours. We got it all done. So at the end of it, I was so tired. I mean, 5 o'clock in the morning, for me was just so incredibly late or early. And so I went off, I excused myself for a minute. And when I came back, I heard piano playing. And I walked back into the studio, and there is Glenn at the piano at the House Steinway or Yamaha or whatever they had in the studio, medium-sized grand, as I remember. And he just started playing, and I'm telling myself, wake up. You've got to wake up. You absolutely have to wake up. This is Glenn Gould, and he's playing for you. And I'd never expected I'd ever hear him play, but he played for probably, I would guess, about 20 minutes. He played the introduction to Capriccio, which is a string sextet, which he arranged for piano. And then he played a lot of the Clytemnestra, Chrysostomus Electra duet from Electra, because both of us love Strauss. And then for quite a while, he played the second movement of the Beethoven second piano concerto, the B flat piano concerto. And he sang along to it and conducted. And it was very, very beautiful. And then he played one variation of the Goldbergs. And he I think it's variation 18 or 19. I can't remember which one it is off the top of my head. But he got about 30 seconds in, and he says, I can't play Baroque music without my chair. And that was the end. That was it. We said goodbye. I went back and went to sleep for a few hours. And he called as I was leaving to say goodbye. And we talked a couple times after that. And, that was that. That was my great, amazing weekend with Glenn in Toronto. And it was a joy. And I'm so glad I'd just gotten a credit card so I could afford to pay for the trip up and the trip back. So It was great.
Wow, this is incredible. And you're very lucky to listen to him play and sing and conduct some sort of a way. During the radio documentary you recorded during this, I mean, late morning or night, there is a comment about Brahms Concerto No. 1, who Glenn recorded with Leonard Bernstein in New York in 1972, and which Gould himself tell of the shock that concert had caused, not only because of the tempo they had chosen, but
Oh, the one in
also
1962, the Brahms. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, at minute 25:20. But he described this amazing concerto. Many classical music lovers still wonder about that incredible concert. What's about you? What's your idea about this concerto?
Well, the thing that's interesting is, soloists and conductors have some disagreements all the time, and they usually settle them. But somehow, I mean, this one went so far. I mean, I'm sure it didn't go around anything like Glenn saying, I won't do it this way, because that was not his style. And he liked Leonard Bernstein. And he thought that Bernstein had the same sportive attitude toward this unusual interpretation that he did. He never held anything against Bernstein about it. I mean, everybody got the idea that Bernstein was very upset with it because of a review that Harold Schoenberg wrote for the New York Times. One of Harold's less well thought through reviews, I must say. So everybody thinks that it was this huge fight, but according to Glenn, and according to a sort of interview with Bernstein that somebody did, it was all fine. I like the performance. And I should add one other thing. Bernstein went on to record the concerto again with Christian Zimmermann. And that's even slower than the one he did with Glenn. So maybe his ideas had changed a bit about the tempos in the concerto. So I don't think it was as much of a fuss as everybody made it out to be. And, in all honesty, it's probably not my favorite Brahms first concerto, but I listened to it and I think it's effective in its own way. It's certainly interesting. It has a grandeur to it, and my ear does not reject it. I'm fine with it. There are just other ones I like even better.
Okay. There is the book, the Glenn Gould readings. It's a kind of Bible for all Glenn Gould lovers and represents such an interesting point to analyze. And this interview is not enough for us. In your enlightening preface to the book, where you collected some material written by the great Canadian pianist, you help us reader to get a better idea of Gould's thoughts in his lucid analysis of the great classical authors of music and behind. What was it like to collect this precious material, which after many years shed light on extremely poignant and interesting topics?
Well, basically, the idea behind the Glenn Gould Reader at the time was we had no real idea that there continued to be such a huge interest in Glenn Gould. I mean, we hope so, but there are times where an artist will die, and then the artist will not, the recordings will not be played, the ideas will not be involved with, will not be discussed all that often. Glenn and I talked about putting together a reader because I liked a lot of his writings. And so we talked about it I'd say a couple times. And his answer was, I'm still in my 40s, which he was. And he said, and it's not a time for summing up yet. So I let that go. But when he died, I wrote immediately to his wonderful assistant, Ray Roberts, who's no longer with us now, I'm sorry to say. And Ray passed it on to Glenn's executor and lawyer, Steve Posen, with whom I'm having lunch in a couple of hours. And the decision was made to include everything that he wrote, pretty much. I think the book is too long. I thought the book was too long then. I think there are too many articles about some subjects that were more or less summed up better in other articles. But because we thought this was our one chance to really get all the Glenn Gould that we knew existed out there and all in one volume, we decided to go with everything. So the book is, as I recall, 450, 500 pages. If I were editing it now, I would probably make it more like 300 pages.
Oh.
Then do a second volume, maybe like, a further collection.
Yes.
Because I do very much like the book and I'm proud of it and I'm happy that we did it, but it's a massive book and it's hard to get all the way through unless you're an absolute fanatic Gouldian, which is good,
Yes.
but we talk actually, and this hasn't gone anywhere. But there's some discussion of doing a much smaller book that will be really the very, very best of Glenn Gould, maybe about 200 pages, something like that. And that's being discussed. And of course, the complete version is still there, although we've found a lot of material since. So the book that was about 450 pages would have been 550 or something like that if we'd had all that material at our disposal. But we were working with everything we had that was in Glenn's apartment at that point, and that's all that we had found to that point. And as I say, more has come out since.
But for us, it's not enough, as you know. So I would like also to talk about your wonderful book, Parallel Play, in which you tell about your experience with Asperger syndrome. During the interview with Tim Maloney, musical historian and Glenn Gould clarinetist, it tells us about a possible link between the syndrome and also in this essay, Glenn Gould's and Asperger syndrome. What do you think about it?
Well, I'm going to say a couple things here. They now have moved Asperger's syndrome into a general autistic spectrum. And I'm very glad about that for a few reasons. Number one, Asperger was a really bad guy. We know a lot about him now. And he was setting aside these children sometimes to be destroyed or something like that, since he was a fervent Nazi, as I understand it. And then it also, I would say when I was diagnosed, which was when I was about 45, there was the idea that all people with autism were people who couldn't speak and who banged their heads and who were more or less cast aside, that, they can't do anything. So they'd throw them in homes or they wouldn't work with them very hard. They'd just say, hopelessly autistic, there's nothing they can do. And on the other hand, when they were differentiating between Asperger's syndrome and autism, there was this equally incorrect idea that all kids with Asperger's syndrome were little geniuses. So you'd have these mothers and fathers, and they'd all be saying, well, yes, he has his strangenesses, but, if you have this, it means you're a genius. And of course, that's not true. There are a lot of people on that side of the spectrum who are, perfectly normal, except that they have, the quirks of mild autism, And so I'm happy that they now lump them together all in one big line called the autistic spectrum. And I actually wrote an article about this, and I'll send it to you. It used to be online, but I have I have a PDF of it. It's because it's not online now, and I'll send it to you, and you're welcome to share it if you'd
Wow,
like.
thank
Matter
you.
of fact, I'd be honored if you'd share it.
It's absolutely illuminating, and even because, as you know, women are recognized Asperger syndrome in recently years, so could be useful for our audience. A lot of people ask about Glenn and Asperger. They had the syndrome, or maybe they are not diagnosed. So thank you. We'll
Well,
accept this
I'll
PDF.
be happy to. I mean, you know, when I decided to write my book, which began as an article called Parallel Play in the New Yorker, I decided that the only reason to write a memoir is if you're going to tell everything. You're going to be absolutely truthful about
Thank you.
everything you say, which sometimes makes me look very strange. And there are things that I confess that perhaps a person who wasn't on the spectrum like me would not have confessed. But, I'm 66 years old now, and I wrote the book when I was in my mid 50s. And, I mean, who cares if, you tell who you are and you try to explain the way you saw things. Maybe it will be helpful for somebody. Maybe somebody will read this and say, wow, I have that feeling too. And I expected that I might be people might treat me strangely, or they would shun me or something like that. It was quite the reverse. I had people who I was actually very, very good friends with. We managed to have a friendship, but even though I was, I had my own quirks, and they said, I really understand you now,
Yeah.
and so in every way, I'm very glad that I wrote the book. I'd write it a little differently now, but I keep all the quirks and everything.
And thank you. This is so important. And one last question. I read an article about music criticism in the last year. What do you think of music critic during the social media era?
Well, the situation now for professional music critics is that they have pretty much disappeared, at least in the States. Europe is still a little bit more appreciative than we are. But I would now say there are probably only about a dozen people in the United States who make their living mostly or entirely writing about classical music. Now, in the old days, you had New York's four main newspapers all had staff classical music critics. Cincinnati had a music critic. All sorts of cities had music critics. Oakland, California, just on and on. And you had, not a huge amount, but certainly 100, maybe 150 or something. And now they're all gone. And increasingly, because of the problems with newspapers, they're hiring people who can also do dance criticism or can also do like elite movies for them. In other words, things that aren't Rocky 7 or something like that. And so the profession has been dying for a while. So that's all bad. The good thing is that online now, everybody can be a music critic to some extent. They can start their own website, they can have a blog, they can and so I like the fact that it isn't just a few people saying this is good, this is bad, which was never the thing that interested me about music criticism anyway. I was mostly interested in the idea of trying to teach people. So it's a mix, it's things change. Newspaper music criticism was not that big a thing for a long time, and now it's sort of been replaced. And there are pros and cons to that.
So thank you so much, Tim, for these wonderful interviews, memories, books, and all you tell us. It's so illuminating. It's so important. And thank you for what you're doing for classical music and for music, for your wonderful work. I mean, I didn't ask about your Pulitzer Prize, but another last questions. What about your memories about 1997 when you received this important prize?
Well, it was all surreal to me, actually, at the time, because it was not a happy time. My mom was sick with Alzheimer's disease. And my best friend died the same week I learned about winning this. So it took me a really long time to come to terms with it, because it was a time of real personal sadness. But at the same time, here's this prize, and it comes along and all the newspapers have me in it, and I'm giving interviews every day, and I'm hearing from my second grade math teacher. And, so it was exciting. But on the other hand, I kind of, for at least a while, kind of wished it would all go away, because it was so overwhelming to me at that point. I also didn't know about my autism then. And so it was a little strange with that. And the thing about a Pulitzer Prize is you have to remember, you change one person on the jury and it would have gone to somebody else. But somehow the stars aligned, so to speak, and there were 5 jurors that year, and of all the criticism of art, music, film, anything, they chose my work about music. And it's still something which you kind of look back on and you go like, wow, that was strange. So of course I'm grateful, but it was a very strange time for me. So you ask an autistic person a question and they'll give you a full answer. I'd love to say, oh, it's just wonderful. But in fact, if I had not gotten it, because the word had gone out that there were 3 finalists, I would have been even more upset probably. But it was a very rough week.
So, Tim, I love your sense of humor. As Glenn, probably you're fantastic, and you're humble. You're positive vibes, and in this time we need these things.
Well, I'm looking forward to meeting you in person sometime.
For me
thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you so much, Professor Tim Page, for this wonderful interview in honor of Glenn Gould's birthday. And see you soon, Tim.